Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, everyone. It's Carl Gottlieb here again with the GDPR Guy, and I'm joined by the amazing, the charismatic, the Florida man himself,
Oh
Pedro
boy.
Pavon. Yeah. This is the first, I'm really excited about this. This is the first Florida man I've actually interviewed. So I'm expecting some amazing stories. So as I say, I'm joined by Pedro Pavon. He's the senior counsel from Salesforce. He's got an amazing background. Worked for the Attorney General's office. He's worked in the military. He's worked in Oracle. So, like, probably obviously Oracle was the hardest of all of those. And now at Salesforce, an amazing career. So I'm really excited to have you on.
Well, I appreciate it. I got to tell you, that's the first time anyone's referred to me as Florida man, and
Are, are,
that's a loaded comment, but I like it. I'll take it. I'll take it.
are you honestly telling me you don't have a story in your background that kind of must relate to some of those crazy things? Like, have you stolen an alligator or
Well, listen,
anything like that?
I've got some Florida man like stories, if you will. I grew up when I first came to the States. I lived on a farm in Dade County near Miami. Not a lot of farms left, but there's a little pocket of Dade County called the Redlands, and it's a agricultural area. So there was my grandfather's farm. It's pretty close to the Everglades, and so as a young kid, 5, 6 years old, I had some interactions with wildlife. We trapped a bobcat one time, which was really interesting,
Cool.
and that was a good vibe. But with respect to alligators, I used to camp in the Everglades a lot. Now, fast forward, I'm a man, I'm an adult. I me and my couple military buddies, we would camp in the Everglades, and this game that we play. I don't know if you know that the Everglades is these big Burmese pythons. They're not from there, but I guess people have released them as pets, and they've kind of, or maybe they're boa constrictor. I don't know, some kind of big snakes. Anyway, the game we would play was when we would spot an alligator or one of these big snakes. Um, Whoever spotted it could pick which one of the other folks had to touch it. And so I've got this amazing photo of me when I was like 20 years old, and I'm squatted wearing like military, like uniform like clothing. And I'm squatted next to this gigantic, like 12-foot snake that I'm leaning over and tapping on its tail. So there's my Florida man story for today.
That's pretty cool. Yeah, I'll give you that one. Yeah, that's kind of up there. So apart from your Florida man tales, what don't most people know about you? Because you are kind of out there in that you're on Twitter, you're on LinkedIn, you are
Yeah.
a speaker, you teach as well. Is that right?
Yeah, I've taught in the past, and I'm going back to it. I'll be an adjunct again in January. So yeah, I've definitely done that. I don't know. I mean, I'm pretty out there. I feel like people know most things. Something I don't really broadcast too much is I mean, it's not that interesting, but I'm an avid motorcyclist. I've been riding a motorcycle since I was a little kid, and I have one in the garage back here behind us. So I really like that. And then I guess kind of tied to that is I'm a super motorsports fan. Like I love Formula One and Formula E and IMSA racing. Like I love car sports. So that's not that cool, but I'm into motorcycling and cars, even though I own kind of like a boring car. My motorcycle is not so boring.
Yeah, that's usually the case, isn't it? Boring car, exciting
Yeah,
bike.
yeah,
So
yeah, yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah, that's allowed. I'm far too scared for that. So yeah, actually owned a Volvo. So yeah. What was the term? They're boxy but they're good. I think was from
That,
the yeah. So
yeah,
I'm not
they're
going to.
like they're like they're like war tanks, those Volvos. So shout out Volvo for keeping a lot of people safe. The motorcycle is scary, man. I'll be 40 years old soon, so I've been riding motorcycles for like 30 some odd years. We're riding bikes for 30 some odd years, and interestingly, I've been put in the hospital twice on a bicycle.
Oh
One, I had a
wow.
punctured lung, all kinds of stuff. So the bicycles have put me in the hospital twice. I've been very lucky on the motorcycles and ATVs. I mean, I've fallen, but like nothing serious has happened. Knock on wood, that continues. But yeah,
Wow, that's slightly scary.
yeah.
I mean,
But
I'm kind of the opinion that God invented cars for a reason. So four wheels good, two wheels bad. That's kind of my view.
yeah.
Um, so you work in tech right now, but tell me about tech in your kind of personal life. What do you spend most of your screen time looking at? Are you a TikToker? Is that the expression these days with the kids?
Yeah.
You know, what are you a gamer? What's your kind of thing?
I have an experimental TikTok account, and what I mean by that is I just go there to see like what is happening, right? And TikTok is kind of, I feel really dated being on TikTok. I would never make one of these kind of like goofy videos. It's not really my style, but it's interesting to watch what the like, Generation Z kids are doing. So I've spent more time on TikTok recently than I ever have. But quite frankly, like my screen time is mostly on the iPad, and yes, people still have iPads, but on the iPad, and it's either on the Kindle, which I'm a pretty avid reader. I read a ton of stuff, or just streaming. Whatever nonsense I'm streaming. I'm a huge documentaries guy, so I watch a lot of documentaries, and I'd say most of my screen time is either work, but in the private side, it's Netflix, Hulu, whatever, or Kindle. Super boring.
Yeah, I'm probably quite similar myself. One of the things I kind of almost insist on is I don't read outside of work, and it's simply because I do
Nice.
so much reading in my job. I guess everyone I speak to says, "Oh, you must read." The most successful
Yeah.
people in the world read all the time when they're
hmm
not working.
hmm
But yeah, it's kind of the last thing I want to do. So
Here's what I'll tell you about that. I agree with whoever's giving you that advice. I mean, you're obviously super successful, so it's not a prerequisite for success. But I will say that, like for example, this is kind of analog, but I've got these 3 law articles here that I'm going to read tonight for bed. Um, I read quite a bit. I don't remember exactly how many I read last year, but a couple years ago, I decided I was going to read 50 books in 12 months, and I did 50.
wow.
It was exhausting. I won't do that again. But on average, I read probably like 20, 25 books a year. And I try to alternate. Like I like novels, I like literature. So I try to do like one novel, kind of lighthearted, and then like one substantive book of some nature, whether it's history or work or whatever it is. And so I just kind of alternate that way. I'm always reading a book. And it's good times.
Excellent, nice mix there. So I guess we should probably start talking about privacy or whatever it is we're meant to be doing as jobs
Yeah.
and things
Yeah.
like that.
Yeah.
So one of the things I wanted to talk to you about was in kind of especially starting with that kind of tech theme was about I guess whether we should even bother doing any of it in the first place, because there isn't really that much regulatory enforcement going on around the world, whether it be in the EU, whether it be in the US, whether it be specific regulations like copper, for instance. You don't see that much stuff going on. I mean, maybe you can pick out a few examples, but the general question remains, is it even worth complying with any of these rules when there is so little regulatory enforcement? What do you think about that?
I mean, it's an interesting question. I'll say I agree with you that there hasn't been, kind of like a ton of compliance over the years, even since GDPR, right? I do notice that kind of an uptick pattern here in the States. FTC is a little bit more active. We'll see what happens in California. There's litigation always in the States, one way or the other, trying to figure, the private bar is always trying to figure out how to, bring more privacy claims here in the States. And just with you, but I see a trend towards more enforcement, whether or to like DPAs or authorities. But to answer your question directly about should we comply, even though there's not a lot of enforcement, I think the answer to that is yes. Uh, you know, I hate overly kind of simplistic analogies, but you know, if we took an approach of, well, there's not a big chance that I'm not going to get pulled over by the police when I drive. Screw it, I'm going to go 95 miles an hour down every road. I just feel like that would be a terrible outcome for everyone involved or around. And so I think in the privacy space, it's somewhat similar. Like I think societies, through the laws that they create, are setting the expectations and requirements for how data should be processed and how people's privacy rights should be protected and preserved. And a lack of enforcement activity shouldn't be a driver for non-compliance. In fact, I think it should be a driver for experimental compliance, meaning like trying to see what are the best ways to comply with the frameworks that are being created through legislation and regulation, and collaborating maybe with authorities who might not have the resources to bring every claim, but working with them to figure out how best to do this and providing feedback about what's working and what's not. So I think the answer is we should comply. The idea that I don't like a law, so I'm going to ignore it is not, for a lawyer is not really a healthy mindset, but for anyone. And so I think there might be some laws on the books now that present some challenges. I'm sure we'll talk about some of them, but I think if we don't like it, we have to try to change it versus just ignore it. I don't think that's a good strategy.
Yeah, it makes complete sense, and I really like your analogy about the kind of speeding thing on the road. And I guess if you kind of look at that analogy a little bit more, you could say one of the reasons we don't, and the reason we do stop at a red light, is there's kind of a cultural pressure to conform. And, if we all didn't do it, then we'd have chaos. Now, you could argue that we don't really have that culture in the corporate world because there's so much other pressure going on. Like there's this kind of expression of move fast and break things in startups, this kind of view of you have to grow product teams, revenue, recurring numbers, all those MAUs, all those kind of targets we have to hit, and privacy can kind of come last on that. So do you think it's the case that you can move fast and break things without moving fast and breaking privacy?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you went out and asked all the folks what they mean, all the folks that kind of came up with that phraseology, move fast and break things, and the people that embrace it, I don't think many of them are going to say we mean break the law, right? I think a lot, I think the spirit of that statement is, bring down old paradigms that don't add value, find ways to create new, better, more efficient, and more meaningful for people, and improve experiences. And I think that's what's at the heart of that statement, right? And of that kind of like, I don't know, ideology or approach. I don't think that privacy is, or privacy compliance necessarily is incompatible with that approach. Or in other words, they're not mutually exclusive. I think you can move fast and break things in the spirit of what that comment really means with respect to innovation, while still complying with the requirements that are set for, are laid out for you depending on what you're doing and what rules apply. With that all being said, though, how we think about privacy is going to change depending on how data, how we value, use, and experience companies using our data, right? And what I mean by that is a lot of the privacy questions that we all deal with in our everyday jobs, me, you, and all of our colleagues, feel like they're really new and emerging, but these are not new concepts, right? Like it's just the application, or better yet, the circumstances in which we're working or we're living in are different. I think if you asked 10 years ago, like, do you understand how companies are using your data? People would have no idea what you're talking about. Like, actually, no clue. What do you mean my data? Like, all I do is post pictures on Facebook, or all I do is, send text to my friends. There was no kind of philosophical or kind of group understanding that while you're doing those things that you love to do online or wherever, the companies enabling all of that are collecting information about how you're operating in that space and learning things about you that you're not necessarily sharing on purpose. Now I think there's a better understanding of that. Not everywhere, but this movie on Netflix, I talked about documentaries. I'm trying to remember what it was called, but it really spoke to this issue. The Social Dilemma, that's the movie, right? The documentary. So The Social Dilemma is an example of how more information about how things function. Now, I think that movie's a little sensational, and there's some, I don't want to say exaggerations, but there's some focus on some things there that, make actually trip people up a little bit. But it does bring attention to the issue that whether you were aware or not before, you have some awareness that, oh, there's more happening here when I'm online than I think that drives a lot of people to better understand what's going on. Why do I say all? Because as society starts to develop awareness about exactly what it means to have your data leveraged to build profiles about you, or for whatever other use case related to your identity, your activities, your behaviors, people will start to the public will start to tell us, hey, these are my, you know, I think what's for regulators is to create frameworks that require the organizations collecting all the data to provide the tools so that the public can make smart decisions about how their information is used and for what purpose and for how long.
So just to pick up on that very, very last point, which I think is a really interesting one in the privacy world, particularly because there's, amongst privacy people like ourselves, you get some that would class themselves as activists, some are kind of pragmatists, some kind of don't care, take the paycheck, happy days. There's many of us in different kind of guises. I'm trying to think. I'd be interested to know whether you think confidentiality is how most activists see privacy, whereas you see privacy more about control. Because I think just to sort of explore that, many people think like, hey, you're taking my data, it's not confidential, therefore there's a privacy issue. Whereas others, maybe like a Google or a Facebook, would argue, no, we're giving you great tools and we're also giving you the tools to control it. And we think that covers those bases.
Well, I think confidentiality implies that there's information or knowledge that you want to hide or avoid others from seeing, right? I think privacy is broader than that. I think that's included in the concept of privacy. I don't want you to know what my favorite cereal is, right? Like that's me trying to keep that confidential. But I think privacy is also really tied to my having the right and capability to exclude you from even the lack of information. Like I might not care. You might be really curious what my favorite cereal is. I might not have one. I might not eat cereal. I might not give a crap about cereal, right? But my privacy is such, at least from where I sit, that I might not want you to know whether I have preferences at all, right? That's not me keeping anything confidential, especially if there's no information there. It's me excluding you from a space that I don't feel like you should have access to, or that I want to grant you access to, right? So I think that's how I think about privacy. Like basically the way it's been framed in the US is kind of like the right to be left alone. Leave me alone is kind of where I start from, or make the case why I should let you not leave me alone, right? And so that's kind of how I think about privacy. We should leave people alone, but if they come to our door, meaning like they want to use our products or services or whatever, or we've come across them while they're browsing the internet and they're on some site that we have some sort of way of knowing that they're there, then let's have a above board exchange about exactly what information we're seeking, right, about each other and how we're going to use it. And as long as that's happening in a way that's meaningful to people so that they can make decisions about whether they want to allow that, visit that website, use that technology or whatever, I think that's a healthy dynamic between companies, the government, and people, right? Full disclosure, meaningful exchange of information about how data is being collected, how it's being used, what information you want, and why.
So on that basis, then, do you think we should, as privacy kind of professionals, give the general public, the individuals, more credit that they do know what is going on? Because you could take the view that, hey, Google, Facebook, whoever are actually doing a good job. You could take that view. They are doing a good job in terms of giving people the information, the transparency, and the control. And therefore, maybe they are making the solid decision of, I feel happy knowing that Google are taking some value from my data, but I like having Google Homes in my house. I know TikTok are getting X data from me, but I want that video. Do you think we should trust people more, or do you think we should say, look, they don't know the harms they are facing?
Well, I think that's a really complicated question, right? And I think it's a little bit of both, right? I think a lot of people are really informed about how things work, and not just professionals like me and you, right? But there's a tremendous amount of people that don't have the energy to give this that much attention, right? That, I need Gmail. I just want to get on there. I'm not going to go spend an hour in my privacy preferences on Google's platform, like configuring it exactly in this custom way that I'm super comfortable with. One of the big failures, I think, of like the privacy space is this idea of, this notice and consent being this like ultimate way to preserve privacy. Because the goal of notice and consent is for people to understand their rights and preserve the privacy that they want to, right? Like that's the goal. Well, providing me a 65-page privacy notice, right? And then asking me to consent to these like vagaries, even if they're detailed, like these precise technical use cases I don't understand. So if it's too vague, I don't understand. If it's super precise, then now it's too technical for me, right? Like, who said this is the best way to do this? Like, I mean, there have to be people dedicated to thinking about more creative ways to have meaningful conversations with the public about how their information is used and what their rights are respective to. I'm not saying I know the answer, but I can tell you as a privacy professional, like I don't read privacy policies unless I have to, right? Like, I mean, I just don't. And I make some assumptions about how companies are going to do things based on how I understand that they operate. I'm sure millions of people do. I don't want to say less sophisticated, but a less informed level because I eat every day. And so I really think at some point we're going to have to rethink how much we value notice and consent, especially insofar as giving people meaningful choice, and try to come up with something creative. In the meantime, you said, well, the Googles and the Facebooks, they're providing lots of tools and lots of options and lots of choice. I think that's true. Like you go on the Google or Facebook platforms, there are a lot of settings you can play with and a lot of things you can do to exercise control over your data. Why are Google and Facebook and other companies doing that? I think, first of all, I believe that fundamentally the companies are not evil and they're trying to do the right thing to help people have choice. Second, they're operating within the framework that the regulators are telling them they have to operate, right? Like, I mean, Google is a super interesting company because they literally said, search be one box and our whole website is going to be just a plain page with one little search bar. So they found out how to make something that on the back end is extremely complicated, super easy for anybody to understand. Imagine if Google didn't have to operate within this like really rigid framework, like prescribed approach to notice, consent, and disclosures. And could be a little bit more experimental to try to share choice or provide choice in ways that maybe consumers would find more palatable. Like, what better place than like a Google or a Facebook to think about more creative ways to do the right thing? So I'm very wary of formulaic requirements, like you must post a do not sell button. Like that is a confusing thing for not just the companies who have to do it, but like the people who have that, right? Like words, they expect my dad to understand, like it's not fair. My dad's 73 years old, like, and he's a handyman. Like he has no idea. He's never going to click on that. He's never going to use it. And so like, how is this a meaningful tool then? It's an interesting question for me.
Yeah, and I can see, like, I think we can all see where the merits of the do not sell tool sort of concept came from, but just the whole execution of it was just kind of awful. I mean, fair play to the Attorney General in California for actually putting out what we're on the third iteration now of the kind of regulations about how to kind of implement some of this stuff. Yeah. Now, just on that, actually, personally, because CCPA is a big thing for you very personally, like you're pretty much focusing on it quite heavily so far. Do you like the constant improvements, you could call it, around CCPA, the kind of the iterations, regulations, and so on? And then clearly onto CPRA, which looks like it is going to happen. Do you like that stage of improvements, or would you rather just kind of let's stick with something that's fairly kind of average for at least a couple of years so we know what to do with it and then iterate more slowly?
Yeah, I think, look, iteration is good because you can improve things over time. And that's not just in privacy, that's just in general, right? So having some sort of capacity for change within within like privacy regulation, I think is healthy. However, iteration at this pace makes things really complicated and difficult, because it's hard in the implementation, in the first implementation phase of something, to iterate on top of that, right? That's really difficult. Like, the law went into effect. There's been, like you said, three rounds of regulations and clarifications. I agree with you that the Attorney General of California is doing the best. That office is doing the best it can based on what is a kind of murky law that they have to work with. Like, they can't just write the regulations they want. They have to write the regulations based on their interpretation of how that law was intended to be implemented and enforced. And so, maybe to some extent, not to their own fault, some of the regulations actually create more confusion than clarity, and it's because they're working from a law that's difficult to interpret. So my kind of a more healthy approach for me would be sort of how GDPR was rolled out, right? It was a long-standing, multi-year process with engagement from stakeholders across the privacy spectrum: regulators, industries, civilians, non-governmental folks, activists. Everybody was involved in the drafting. There were hundreds and hundreds of pages explaining how language became to be, and interpretations from multiple data protection authorities, which some people say that's confusing, but I don't think so. I think it's kind of helpful. I like that approach a lot more than this kind of fast track regulatory iteration, because if you have a big operation and you're trying to implement a compliance strategy, and every 30 days or so you have to make changes, not only is that expensive and difficult, and those costs end up getting passed along to ultimately the consumers, right? But also you can get it wrong, like and unintentionally get it wrong. It feels like booby traps if it's moving too quickly. And so I'm not a super fan of the rapid pace iteration process. With all that being said, if we find a grave error and there's consensus and making a change to solve a serious problem, I think that there should always be some mechanism to do that quickly.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I also find it a little bit embarrassing as well when I have to go to my colleagues and say, hey, it's changed again. And some of these people need like a year's notice, maybe more, because it fundamentally changes, let's say, the architecture and the strategy of the business. And that I was talking to a marketing person today that works in the kind of web, like the web front end for a place, and he said he needs like 6 months notice for any change regarding like cookie banners, do not sell, any of those kind of mechanisms. You put do not sell into the back end of a product, and my God, you're talking at least years. And then CPRA comes along and says, well, hey, public information might not be included in that anymore. And suddenly your scope is completely reduced potentially. So, I've got a client that works in that area, and that could change things massively. So yeah, it's kind of frustrating, but also good. But then, hey, CPRA comes along, and I know many of the people you and I know are really against the CPRA for many very good reasons. But I guess personally, are you optimistic about what CPRA will do? Like, do you think it will create some kind of certainty, even if it's a bad place, it'll create like a rock solid base where you can at least work from?
Here's my biggest, I've got a lot of apprehensions with CPRA, but the principal one for me is how it essentially handcuffs the California legislature to make changes to the law, right? There's some very narrow circumstances in which the legislator can act, but otherwise it just has to live with the language in that law, and the only way to change it is through another referendum process, which is extremely lengthy and slow. If we roll out CPRA and there's a and we won't know until folks try to implement it, and the California DPA, which the CPRA creates, starts to enforce it. If there's something fundamentally wrong with this thing, that is, staunching innovation, is really maybe delivering a bad result for consumers, like, we don't know. It is going to be really hard to fix it. Based on how CPRA doesn't allow for these modifications and changes that we were just talking about. So I'm not a super fan in that regard. I don't think that's a good way to legislate. I think, we could be in some trouble if the implementation of this thing doesn't work out well. That's my least favorite thing about that thing. I can go on for 5 years, but I don't want to, because I've got to go out there and defend compliance strategies, right? So, but that's my least favorite part. I think it's just not a good way to govern, right?
Yeah, absolutely. The CCPA, just like the GDPR and other kind of basic kind of fair information privacy principles, have always talked about the concepts of like reuse of data. The service provider, the data processor kind of model. And one of the things that you personally have made a massive mistake on LinkedIn on your profile is mentioning that you're especially interested in a particular area. So I'm going to pick on that and dive straight into it, because it's a really interesting kind of thing for me as well. How does a service provider or data processor get permission to reuse customer data to help train their AI models, their ML, or basically improve their service? Because this is one of those classic things that I see a lot of people do, but nobody talks about it. And if you look at DPAs, it's very hard to find it explicitly stated in there how it's done and in what way. Are people anonymizing data? What's the technique people should do? Should you call it out? Should you hide it? What do people do? You work for some really big service providers, so I'd love your insight on this.
Yeah, look, and I won't speak specifically to what anywhere that I've worked or work at is doing, but I will say generally my approach to getting the appropriate rights to do model training for machine learning is to be transparent and upfront about it. Okay. And it's less about privacy than it is about licensing. Okay. Like that data doesn't belong to you. Right. It belongs to your customer or your data subject or wherever you're collecting the information from. Right. And so telling them that you're going to use it for this purpose is important, whether you anonymize it or not. Like, I don't think that matters. I think if company A is giving you access, forget personal data for a second, to just their commercial information, and you're going to use that to do model training to make your product better, I feel like you should tell it. And you shouldn't bury that. You can go see Oracle's contracts on their website, for example, and you'll see that the language about using data for these purposes pretty prominently placed in their contract, in their cloud services contract, right? And it's something I was really proud of when I worked there, to be able to contribute to, kind of implementing that approach. I don't think we hit the ball very much. I think Salesforce is the same way. We're very super transparent about use cases that aren't very specifically tied to delivering the service the customer is buying, right? Other companies are less transparent. I won't say names, but some really do bury that information in like documentation that is 500 pages long, and it's on page 430, and it's a license right in a document that you can unilaterally change. Just basic principles of contract. I'm just not sure that that's like super enforceable, right? Now let's tie it all into privacy. When personal data is involved in the data set that you want to use for these purposes, now you've got some additional responsibilities if you're the processor, right, or the service provider. I think one is to give your customer enough information about what you're doing so that they can make sure there's a legal basis for it on the back end, right? If not, you're kind of setting them up for failure. Like if they're the ones who are interacting with the data subject, in most cases, when you're a service provider, if you don't give them enough information about the use case, how can they make sure that there's an appropriate legal basis to pass that data on to you so that you can use it for the purpose that you want? So not being transparent is you setting up your customer for failure and yourself for failure, right? I don't think that is a smart approach at all. And then I think the last piece is having a transparent and straightforward mechanism for communicating these use cases is important as a service provider, because while you might not have a direct legal duty to that data subject, data subjects perception about you is going to be based on how they think they're interacting with you. So if you're some shadowy company in the back end somewhere that they sort of hear of and know that they're up to something, if you don't have information about how you use data from your customers and data from the public for your own development purposes, kind of prominently placed and in an easy to understand way, over time, people are just going to be suspicious about what your business is. And there's plenty of examples of companies out there that nobody's really sure what they do, but everybody feels kind of spooky about them. I won't say names, but people know who they are. I don't think you want to be one of those companies. Anybody wants to be one of those companies, because in the short term, it might be okay, but in the long term, if you ever do have to build a relationship of trust from the public, you're working from a negative, so anyway.
Do you, I mean, as you were saying before, get involved in teaching. Do you find that the students you're teaching understand, especially in the kind of engineering world, understand the concept that data isn't just data? Data, it might be somebody else's data. There might be licensing rights, might be privacy rights, those kind of things. And the reason I kind of raise that is I do sadly get to work with a lot of engineers, new ones, old ones, that do just see data as data. They see a data lake as this great thing that they can just do lots of exciting things with. And you kind of sadly have to kind of talk about privacy by design, privacy by default, GDPR, CCPA, all this kind of boring stuff that they go, oh God, voice of doom coming from Carl again. But I wonder, is there a gap at the kind of engineering university stage?
Look, I don't think at the education, I don't have an engineering background, but what I can say is over the last few years, I've seen a super increase in topics such as data ethics, data privacy, data governance being taught to engineering students in super comprehensive ways. I don't know any school specific curriculum, but I know that it's requirements in a lot of programs for, data scientists and stuff to take these courses. 10 years ago, I just don't recall that being an area of emphasis, and I know now it is. For example, the class I'm teaching in the spring is to law students, but one of the big components of that class is data ethics. We're going to talk about data ethics. What does that mean? How do you write a contract to account for the ethical concerns that arise from data use cases that involve people's sensitive and personal information? So I do think that there is a transition towards higher awareness, and not just that, but education and training around how to process and access and collect information in a way that is not just compliant with the rules, but is responsible and ethical, right? I'll say about, I think the first part of your question was very much like, what is my experience with students? And I'll say this, like Generation Z grew up on social media, grew up on the internet. Like, I grew into it, right? Like it wasn't around when I was a little kid, but then there it was. These folks, grew up with social media in front of them, and iPhones and iPads and laptops and Alexa and all this stuff, right? They have a strong preference, and you can see this in ephemeral methods of social media, right? So like where like old millennials like me, we had, in the late, 10 years ago, my Facebook had thousands of photos that are permanently made available for anyone to see. You don't see that with Generation Z. Everything is, stories and TikTok and things that disappear quickly, and got 24 hours to enjoy this thing, and then it goes away. So I don't know that I go so far to say that the next generation of kids, Generation Zers, have a fundamental, comprehensive understanding of like the legal and societal implications of all of their data being available online for anyone to see forever. But I will say that they demonstrate a preference for it not to be that way, and an appreciation for how things don't age well. Especially when they're posting in their like teenage years, right? So like that's why you see that Snapchat still hangs around. You see how Instagram has adapted and created channels that are more ephemeral for people to post things that aren't always there. Facebook's done the same thing, and I think that trend's going to continue.
Yeah, and it's good to see the regulations kind of going that way as well. Like you're starting to see more pop-up saying regulations pop up around rules such as, hey, by the time you get to 18, you can then kind of wipe your history. We're starting to see more, let's say like in Brazil or China, new acts around parental consent. There does seem to be, and even the CCPA and CPRA trying to push that, trying to push the US towards 16 rather than 13. I know there's been some proposals about changing COPPA to go to 16 as well. So we're certainly seeing a lot more push towards child privacy. And it seems, as you're saying, that children are definitely towards that kind of way as well.
I think so. And I think we have to be careful because, like, God, if everything I did from age 12 to 17 was online today, that would be extremely humiliating. I'm just going to leave it at that. I mean, I was a clown when I was a kid in many ways. I also, was a little mischievous and was up to some things that were probably pretty sketchy when I was a teenager, right? So I would not want that history to be out there. But I think I'm fundamentally a good person, I hope. And then a lot of those experiences shaped me into the adult that I am, right? And so we want to be really careful not to scare kids into not being experimental and figuring out who they are in their teenage years for fear of them being judged later when they're 30, 40 and, trying to be serious adults or whatever it is. And so social media, specifically creating all of these tools for things to disappear and fade away and go away, will allow children and teenagers the social bandwidth to make mistakes, which is how we learn, without being punished for those mistakes 100 years later, right? Like, I just don't think that would be fair, and that chilling effect would be detrimental overall. I think it would hurt. It would create more problems than it would solve if we didn't let them act like teenagers.
Absolutely. I sometimes talk to my wife about this and say, how do we sort of grow up as kids without the internet? How did we go through university without the internet and all this kind of stuff? And then I think, thank God we didn't have the internet when we were growing
For
up.
sure, man.
It's kind of scary. I want to pick up on a point you made just before about transparency, how it seems like that's kind of a key thing in your mind to help us all, really. And I want to get your view about whether you think transparency as a principle sets us free as privacy professionals to kind of do really amazing things, whether you be a lawyer, whether you be a DPO, whatever you might be, or whether, and how that kind of works when most lawyers don't like the principle of transparency because that's kind of the principle to stay the hell away from.
I see what you mean. I don't think that approach is productive in the context of helping people make decisions about their privacy and how their information is used. I understand the risk-averse lawyer mindset of, well, if we overshare, it's going to come back to bite us. Well, the reality is that the way privacy regulation works is that it's the exact opposite. If you undershare, that's almost always what comes back and bites you. If you don't explain and make available information in a meaningful way to people, or you mislead them, that's when you start to get into trouble, right? And so, I push back on, let me start at the very beginning. Lawyers are well equipped to manage risk, but they're not always the best group of people to make decisions about how to innovate and advance thinking, right? Like, I think all my lawyer friends will get mad at me for this, but I say it all the time and I don't care. Being a lawyer is kind of not that creative, right? Like, when you go to law school, what you're taught is, here's a legal problem. Let's go backwards and ask a bunch of dead old white men what they thought about this, and then develop a theory about what an outcome should be based on what they said. Like, what? That's not a way to think about our privacy, privacy problems that we're facing because of the proliferation of the internet and all this data that gets created about us. I just don't think that's a super helpful way to do it. The people best equipped to make these choices and figure out how we're going to best address this are technologists, are engineers. I think these people have the skills and mental tools to think creatively about how to deliver information in a way that's meaningful and easy to understand. Lawyers just have to tell them what that information is, right? Like, that's our big role. It's like, what do you need to share? This is it. This 500-page document, this is what we need to make clear to the public. And then people much more interesting and creative than lawyers will find ways to package that information in a way that's digestible. That isn't a 500-page disclosure on a website. Because, transparency doesn't mean, deliver a treatise, right? Like, that's not that transparent because nobody can read it or understand it. Transparency to me means providing meaningful, actionable information that people can digest quickly, because that's how people take in information these days, and make meaningful choices about.
So we've had a question from Andy Dale, who was on the previous episode of this show. He's general counsel at Alice, the gifting company. And Andy asks, why haven't we seen any innovation in notice and consent interactions? Why no videos, explanations, or chats, etc.?
It's a great question. And, I was thinking the other day about this issue, which is like, why isn't there more interactive transparency about privacy? Meaning, you're there, someone's available to explain something to, if I read a privacy statement on whatever.com and I have a question about what something means, I have to send an email to privacy@whatever.com and, wait 30 days or whatever for somebody to give me some blueprint, a boilerplate answer, right? Like, how helpful is that? Like, I'm trying to make a decision about whether I want to use this app right now. And so, to Andy's question, which is a great one, I think we're going to have to really figure out how to invest in these types of solutions that people can get information in real time when they have doubts or are confused about the information that they're being asked to make decisions about. It doesn't mean that companies have to invest $1 billion and have phone bank, people waiting to answer phone calls. We have AI. We have AI chatbots. Look, when a company wants to sell me something, they'll put a really smart chatbot in my face, and it'll ask me all kinds of questions and interact with me in all sorts of ways. So why not try to adapt some of those technologies and adopt them in the privacy context? We're starting to see some of this stuff. I'm starting to see some of it happening. So hopefully there's more of that. Like, how cool would it be to have an interactive conversation with some, with a bot or whatever about questions I have about what do you mean if I check this box, Google can do research with, research and development. What is that? What is research and development? And to have like a sort of human conversation about that, a human-like conversation about that might be helpful.
And I guess that's where transparency comes straight back in, because if you can only be transparent, or especially as a lawyer, you'll only ever be transparent and be able to do some of these interactive notice consent things when you've got nothing to hide. And so that kind of principle of transparency almost pushes you into being responsible and doing the right thing with data, because it's just so much easier. And I think maybe I'm being maybe a bit optimistic here in some people's minds, but I think the ones that are showing you all this information, giving you all these tools, generally do have less to hide, because it's just so damn hard to be transparent, add controls, and also hide stuff.
Yeah, I think that's right. And, we look at the companies that are always getting, punched in the mouth by the media and by regulators, the Googles and the Facebooks and the Twitters. Name me companies that share more information about their data processing practices than those three companies. I'll wait. I mean, they literally are setting the standard for transparency in some ways. Now, that doesn't mean they're not making mistakes. That doesn't mean that they haven't gotten some things wrong. And that also doesn't mean that there isn't room to improve. But I know more about what Google does with my data than almost any other company that I deal with, right? Including Apple, right? I literally know more. Now, I think Apple has come a long way in the last couple of years, but does that change my perception of Google? Maybe, maybe not. It might for me, it might not for someone else. But to say that these companies aren't doing what they can to be transparent, I'm not sure that that's super accurate. So anyway, I don't know. A lot of this is about perception and less about actual information. Because I think if, accusing Google of not providing information about its data collection and processing practices is an intellectually dishonest accusation, because they do. Now, do they need to provide more? We can have that discussion. Like, have they gone so far into the deep, data processing space that even though they provide this wealth of information, it needs to be more? Let's have that chat. But like, to accuse them of being like, a shadowy figure, no. Like, you want me to name a shadowy figure? The NSA, right? The NSA is shadowy. I don't know shit about what the NSA does with my data, but I know they're out there being sketchy, right? And what's interesting to me is, unlike the NSA, Facebook, Twitter, Google, Snapchat, Apple, Microsoft, they can't do some things that the NSA can do, like, meaning the government. The government can withhold your liberty. The government can take your life in some countries, right? Google's not in a scenario where they can do those things, right? Neither is Facebook. So the stakes are so much higher with respect to, for example, like NSA's data collection activities or, surveillance activities by other governments. And nobody's giving that the attention, the same level of scrutiny that we're giving these social media companies that are just using, at least as far as we know, using all of this information about you to sell you stuff, which, is a harm, but it's not the same thing as jail.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, some people talk about privacy is dead. It's a kind of long-standing bit of rhetoric. I don't think either of us agree with it in any way. The concept of
Yeah,
privacy is dead. But
yeah.
so do you think things are actually better in privacy as an individual, as a consumer? Do you think we are? Do you think we have more transparency? Do you think we have more control than maybe we did 5 years ago?
We certainly don't have more privacy than we did 5 years ago, right? Because there's so many more things um, uh, observing us, right? So just by default, we're our private. I think people in 1980 lived far more private lives than they do in 2020 if they're engaged in on the internet, right? So I don't think our privacy has improved. But your question was actually something different, which is, do we understand how our information is being used better today than we did a few years ago? And I think the answer for that is there's enough information for us to do so. And I think each of us has to take it upon ourselves to decide whether we want to know or more. I think generally the public is better informed. I think there's more awareness that if you're not careful with and selective about who you share information with, potential harms are out there. But with all that being said, I don't think the average person is a expert at data processing, right? And we shouldn't expect them to be, right? Like that, I have no idea how the airplane keeps me safe when I'm flying, but I know it does. And I know there are folks inspecting that plane and government organizations reviewing, the airline and making sure they meet certain standards, and I feel safe flying. Well, I think we need to get to that stage on the internet where I might not know all the bells and whistles about everything and how it's functioning, but I have some confidence that there's a, infrastructure full of experts that helps regulate how all of this is happening so that I'm safe. That's where I hope we head, because the idea that we're going to expect every consumer to be a data privacy expert is unrealistic and not fair.
So do you think, I mean, do you feel generally optimistic about the future for kind of individuals' privacy?
I think that if we have sensible regulation, and we're still trying to figure out what that is. I don't know that GDPR is sensible. We'll see, right? We'll see over the course of. But if we have sensible regulation that holds data aggregators, data collectors, data processors, all of the company, that huge ecosystem of companies, which at this point is every company that's collecting information about us to some, well thought out and meaning, and that consumers make meaningful choices about how can interact with them, then I'm optimistic. If we create overburdensome regulation that is too costly, I actually think the harm is bigger to people, right? Like, I can't think about all of the free services that we take advantage of every single day. I use Instagram, I use WhatsApp. Half the apps on my phone don't charge me a thing. There's no going back from that. I'm not going to give up Gmail. Like, there's no chance. And so we have to make sure that regulation doesn't stifle all of the creature comforts and amazing benefits that like an ads-based freemium internet has provided us. So the other horrible extreme is that we do nothing and we just let companies run wild. I don't think that's the right thing either, right? Because there are dangers there too. So I don't have any, I wish I had like a specific roadmap for you, but I think if we operate from a position that we're going to try to be sensible, be inclusive, and have stakeholders, all the stakeholders involved in the discussion of how we govern ourselves going forward together, that gives us the best chance to end up in a future where we've struck a decent balance between people having the ability to protect their space and, again, exclude others if they want to from knowing anything about them, but still have an awesome, interesting, thriving internet that creates all of this amazing benefit for the world.
It definitely feels like the incentives are growing for companies and organizations to be more responsible, more ethical with privacy.
Yeah.
I mean, even amongst us privacy professionals, I think there's even then a drive to just be do what's easier, which is the transparent method, which is the open method, better consent, better openness. It's just easier and it just pays off in the long term. I think we'll maybe moving less from regulation, sort of the negative side of privacy, towards the more positive side, and things like privacy by default, by design, that have come from, that are old principles, but hey, the GDPR pushed them into law. It's great to see. I mean, generally, do you think? I think you've actually mentioned before in previous podcasts you've done that you think it's a great time to be a privacy professional, to work in this field. Could you talk more about why you think now is an exciting time for that?
Yeah, look, I mean, what better time to be involved in a movement than at the beginning, right? Like, I just think it's super cool to be the ones who are framing how privacy is going to be governed, regulated, and implemented, forever, right? It's just really nice. I've never, uh, it just pays to be first in a lot of ways. You get to impose your will. Like, not impose your will is too strong, but you get to influence the outcome in a way that you can't if you come in later and are just executing on design, right? Like, I mean, I guess the example is like, if you're a constitutional lawyer, right, in the United States, what better time to be like? Would you rather be sitting at the table with Thomas Jefferson or sitting at the table in like 1985 with, I don't know, whoever? Like, obviously, like, how cool would it have been to be there drafting the document that, for the last 200 years has set the tone for how we govern ourselves? So I think privacy is we are the founding parents, right? All of us. And what I love about it too is, in the last 5 years, especially, you've seen an explosion of diversity in our field, right? Like, when I first started doing this, I guess now like 12 years ago, whatever it is, a lot of old white dudes telling me what privacy was about, right? And that made me a little uncomfortable. But I think now, some of our top deepest thinkers in our profession are women, people of color, young people. There's just a great, diverse group of folks making privacy great, and I think it's just the best time to do this.
Yeah, we've even got people from Florida, which is kind of
even Florida man is helping with this thing.
Who'd have thought it? Who'd have thought it? I mean, I guess one final question I want to ask about that specific area. If you're looking at privacy as an area to move into, let's say you're a lawyer, you've been focusing on that as more of a generalist. Do you think the kind of hyper specialization within privacy is the area to go? So, you pick out privacy and then say, I want children's privacy, I want to do California, and I want to do student, whatever it might be. Or do you think business skills are where it's at, pushing privacy into the product side of a business?
Well, if you're a lawyer,
where would you push people?
If you're a lawyer, right, and you want to be a privacy practitioner, look, privacy is not dead, but the idea of the privacy generalist, I think, is dead. That's over. Like, there's no chance with the explosion in kind of sectoral and use case specific regulation that's happening, that 10 years from now, there's going to be one person who can say, yeah, no, I know everything about privacy law. Like, that's not possible, right? Not to mention that there's geographical disparity, right? Like, how can you say I'm an expert at GDPR, LGPD, CCPA, CPRA? Like, there's no way. Like, HIPAA, COPPA, like, no. Just to give you an example, like, I'm familiar with all of the rules I just read off, but like, there's people who've forgotten more about LGPD than I'll ever know, right? And so if I have an LGPD question, I want to ask them. And so I think hyper specialization is underway. It's going to happen. If you want to be a chief privacy officer, you're obviously going to have like a well-rounded exposure. So maybe, let's say for me, like my area of expertise is like ad tech and AI, right? Like, let's just say that's where I've made I've done most of my work over the last 10 years or so, right? Okay, cool. I have some familiarity with HIPAA, but if my client comes and asks me, hey man, I need to make a HIPAA decision, what do I do? Like, well, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to call, so-and-so at such and such and find out, because I have no idea, right? Like, so I think hyper specialization for sure. Now, if you're not a lawyer, I actually think lawyers have the same opportunities, but if you're not a lawyer, especially if you're on the engineering side of things, there are a lot of opportunities to uh, create like privacy technical careers, like privacy by design. You talked about it before, right? Like, um, if you're an engineer with like a privacy framework understanding or certification, or just implement that as you build in the process, I think the highest demand going forward over the next few years is going to be for technical folks who can implement the requirements of the laws in the technologies themselves. I can't do that. Like, if you say, if I can read off the requirements, this product needs 1, 2, 3, and 4. How to build that is a black box for me. I don't have the technical know-how. The folks who have that technical know-how and the privacy substantive knowledge, those are going to be the most valuable the piece. And I think lawyers are going to have to take a step back and perform more traditional roles that they have in other parts of the, in other practice areas.
Fantastic. It's certainly an exciting time, and I know it's one that keeps us both busy. So I'll leave you to it. But thank you very much, Pedro, for your time. It's been great talking to you, and yeah, have a great evening.
Hey, thanks, man, and thanks for the invitation. You've already put on another podcast, but like your setup for your podcast is world class. This is better than like, Joe Rogan. Nice work.
Hey, it's an absolute pleasure. You're worth it. All right, take care. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, brother.